Hello, my name is Voya and welcome to My Deep Guide, and in today's video we are checking out the Kindle Scribe Gen2, the 2024 version. And initially this was supposed to be like an in-depth review, however further analysis revealed that the similarities between Kindle Scribe Gen1 and Gen2 are so close that there's no really point to just repeat and regurgitate the same info. What I rather wanted to do was, while it is an in-depth exploration of the Kindle Scribe Gen1, it is done from the perspective of how it compares to and what are the differences, the meaningful differences, observable and measurable differences between Kindle Scribe Gen1 and Gen2, because contrary to my first impressions, there's actually more than meets the eye, but you need to employ really in-depth type of measurements and analysis, and thankfully that's where the still in development but slowly being implemented mydeepguide's display analysis framework, or DAF, comes into play. So let's see how Kindle Scribe Gen2 2024 version compares to the original and what are the meaningful differences, if there are any. So Kindle Scribe has gotten a redesign in the new Gen2 2024 version. I've already covered the majority of things that are important in my unboxing and first impressions. At the first glance, they genuinely do appear like the exact same device, but just with the new set of paint coat. So you have a margin and you have a choice between black and this color that I have here, which is very nice. But other than that, everything seems to be exactly the same, including the software. So if you haven't watched the first impressions video, I do invite you to watch that, because that's where you will get most of the information about the functionalities. I explore all of the AI functionality and all of the improvements that the new update has brought to the table, and those are being advertised as new features on the Kindle Scribe Gen2, but the reality is that as soon as you update your Gen1 Scribe to that same firmware update, you will have the same type of functionality, with the asterisk that the AI functionalities are geo-restricted in some locations. So from what I've heard, UK is one of those locations where the AI functionality is actually restricted, so you won't have it, but you won't have it on either of them. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Other than that, specs are the same, everything is exactly the same seemingly. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we have a very nice design, excellent build quality as we've had with the Scribe 1, and I think that generally that the design has been improved and that it does look nicer, although I maintain that the white frame, I like that they added a white frame, but I think that it would have been better if the white frame was actually matching the color whiteness of the screen. So if the frame was not white, but it was actually this shade of gray, I think that it would have been better for the reader overall, because the contrast between the content and the white frame would have been less. This way we do have this stark contrast between the frame and the content on the screen. Other than that, I really love the color scheme in general. I'm not a fan of so many different greens, but at least they are matching, you assume. So two different greens are matching on the pen and on the device, and then it just kind of makes this cohesive kind of thing. And I'm a sucker for details, and I know this is a tiny thing, but I really love the fact that the rubber feet on the teal version are actually matching the color. That tickles my fancy in a good way. Build quality, excellent. Designed, really good, with that caveat here. And other than that, everything exactly the same as the Kindle Scribe Gen1. Or is it? Through the testing initially, like with just my eyeballs and comparing these things, the displays do actually seem really on par, as if the device is exactly the same, as if we're really dealing with the same device. So you can see that we have the color chart that I normally use for testing these things out, and we have the landscape orientation and contrast set to 1, and let's just match the margins so that they're exactly the same on both of them. And basically, if we check out the same content with the gradient of colors here, we can see that we really do have a nice range from pure black to pure white, very nice grayscale handling, and and excellent handling of the darker color spectrum here, which normally devices of this type are wrongly calibrated and then they get that really wrong. This is one of the reasons why people prefer Kindle in general and Kindle Scribe for reading, and why they say like, oh, it has an excellent image quality, because it actually does have that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a different panel or a better panel. It just means that it's configured and balanced properly, as can be seen on both of these. Now, whether or not there are small differences visually, optically, yes, you can see them, but they're too small for them to genuinely call them really different. One thing that I do notice, and I think that it's going to be a little bit more difficult for the camera to pick that up, but this region here exposes to my eyes, at least visually when observing, that the consistency of colors is better on the Gen 1, and I almost can perceive a little bit more fuzziness or kind of noisiness or inconsistencies in these same colors on the Gen 2. And that was something that I have noticed when I did the back-to-back on different contents, that generally speaking, the personal subjective impression was that the image was fuller and more concentrated on the Gen 1, whereas on the Gen 2 it was a little bit more diluted. Now, thankfully, we no longer have to rely on these subjective interpretations and using words like diluted or things like that, because as some of you know, I am in the process of establishing a new way of quantifying results and the image quality in these devices. And if you're interested to learn more about that, you can find more with the video dedicated to that, where I explain all of that, so you can find it in the card there or in the description below. That test is called My Deep Guide Display Analysis Framework, and it consists out of 4 tests. Currently, only the first one is near completion, and it deals with contrast and uniformity of the image. And I have preliminary test results that actually can quantify for us that difference between the display of the Kindle Scribe 1 or Gen 1 and Kindle Scribe Gen 2. So let's examine that. And when checking the preliminary test results, so please remember this is still not completely calibrated to the level that I wanted, but it does give a good representation, and most importantly, it gives a consistent and precise relative comparison between the devices. So while the numbers themselves relative to the paper value may change, and the contrast value may kind of change in the overall value of how it's being calculated, the relative values between the devices will remain the same. When you're checking out the whiteness and blackness intensity levels, we can see that the Scribe 2 and Scribe 1 are basically neck and neck, but that the Scribe 2 is marginally better than Scribe 1 in whites, so marginally whiter whites than the Scribe 1. This is within margin of error for sure, but the blackness is more intense and above margin of error. So at 0.67 for Scribe 2, it has better blackness than the Scribe 1. That means that when we calculate the contrast out of whiteness and blackness, the Scribe 2 has a measurably higher contrast ratio by around 7%, according to these measurements, than the Scribe 1. So there's definitely a measurable difference in contrast and whiteness and blackness between these two seemingly identical devices. When we go to the noise score or the noise index score, this is separately measured for noise in white content and noise in black content. And here we can see a slightly different picture, and something that actually makes sense with the observation and the personal impression that I had. Because remember, when we were checking out the color chart, the impression that I had was that it was a little bit more denser on Scribe 1, and that on Scribe 2 that it seemed a little bit fuzzier. And actually we can see a measurable difference in the noise here, and we can see that the Scribe 1 has a noise ratio for whiteness at 0.354, while that is considerably higher, so much noisier whites on Scribe 2 than it is on the Scribe 1. And that is not just a measurable difference, this is actually an observable and noticeable difference when you have them back to back. As far as the noisiness in the blacks, the situation is a lot better. While Scribe 1 is still better, so it has less noisier blacks than the Scribe 2, the difference is much, much smaller, and this is something that, while not in the margin of error, I don't think that it's really that observable. And finally, when we check the uniformity of colors, again, the uniformity of white content and uniformity of black content has been measured for both Scribe 1 and 2. Here we can see, again, consistency, but a much smaller difference between Scribe 1 and 2, but it's still there. The difference is definitely within the margin of errors, with 0.996 versus 0.995. And a similar situation is with the blacks as well, with 0.946 uniformity for blacks on Scribe 1 and 0.945 uniformity of blackness on the Scribe 2. Now, while these are preliminary results, right, please remember that this is still not completely finalized, tuned, and calibrated, but it's getting there. However, the display analysis framework results for the visual contrast are that Scribe 2 overall has a higher score. That's because it has a higher contrast ratio, and at 3.65, while Scribe 1 has a result of 3.41. This final result will change because the way the final visual contrast is currently being calculated is not up to par with what some of the studies are suggesting with the importance and the relevance and the skewness of whiteness, blackness, and contrast when measured for the overall visual perception of contrast. That number will change, and the result may well change once the test is being finally calibrated and retested and kind of finalized, but current preliminary results are these. What is less likely to change is the screen integrity, because the noise and uniformity, that's just how it's measured, and it doesn't really depend on the aspects that the visual contrast does depend on. And here we can see that there is definitely a significant difference in screen integrity between Scribe Gen 1 at 0.832, and incidentally it's topping the charts as the device with the highest quality perception of a display. And we can see that Scribe 2 is way lower at 0.684, and this is mainly due to that increased noisiness in the whiteness or the white content displayed on the new Kindle Scribe. And in this video I'm going to be showing you preliminary test results of the illumination aspects of a device. This is the third out of 4 tests that will be encompassing the display analysis framework that I've talked about previously. This test serves the purpose of basically showing you not only the light properties, so it can measure the front light aspects directly, so the front light color, intensity, and also the front light intensity across the different intensity levels of the front light. So the characteristics of the front light. E-ink devices are effectively reflective displays. They are reflecting the ambient light towards you, the viewer. And if you actually measure the reflectance intensity, so how much are they able to reflect the intensity of the light that they are in, and if you have a very carefully controlled conditions where absolutely everything is exactly the same between the devices, then you can have a relative comparison that is meaningful between the devices, and you can see which device is more effective at reflecting the ambient light. This test is measuring the intensity of light that's reflected directly from the screen. It is reflecting first the pure white content and then pure black content, and we're comparing these two back to back. And we can see that the Kindle Scribe 2 is marginally but still more effective at bouncing the environment light to you as a viewer. This is equally measured between both of the whiteness and the blackness. Then we get to the heart of this test, because it's meant to mainly characterize the front light and display what are the characteristics of it. And here we are measuring 2 different types of values. The Kelvins are basically the temperature or the color of the front light, and it goes from fully cold, which is this first value, then to fully warm light, and then to a 50-50 mix. And Kindle Scribe 2 has a little bit colder cold front light. The warm light is basically identical, almost exactly the same, so definitely within a margin of error. 10 kelvins doesn't really matter at all. And then we have the mix, which then gradually gets to be a little bit different between the two, and that's simply because that cold light is colder on the Kindle Scribe 2. The lower measurement here in lux is the intensity of the front light, again corresponding to the fully cold, fully warm, and in mix. And you can see that the intensity between Kindle Scribe 1 and 2, the front light corresponds almost exactly the same. And finally we get to the intensity curve of the front light, and this is measured with the front light being exactly at the 50% mix of cold and warm color of the front light, so smack down in the middle. And then we have the intensity going from 100, then to 75%, 50%, and down to 30% of the intensity of the front light. And this is measured so that we can see the curve or the ramp of the front light intensity, how it's calibrated, and what you can expect to get. And we can see that they are very, very closely resembling here, definitely within the margin of error. So we have the same type of curvature of front light intensity on both Kindle Scribe 1 and 2. With the front light intensity, when it's set at maximum, it gives off around 325 lux intensity. Then when you go down to 75%, it drops all the way down to 81%. And at 50 we have 20 lux, and at 30% we have only 4 lux. And if we check the spectral distribution of the warm light, so pure 100% warm light on both Kindle Scribe Gen 1 and Gen 2, we can see that the spectral data, this is on the left hand side Scribe 1, on the right hand side we have Gen 2. It is a very, very similar type of spectral curve, and while it is not completely blue light free, that little spike of blue light present on both of them. However, the intensity of that blue light spike is quite low. When we check the 50% color mix between Scribe 2 and Scribe 1, we can actually see that that measurable coldness of the cold light being colder on Gen 2 is shining through here. As you can see that the blue light spike is higher on the Scribe Gen 2 than it is on the Gen 1. So the spike here is the maximum measurement, so it is at 1. And then you can see when we're transitioning over to the warmer spectrum of the wavelength of the color that's emitted by the front light, we can see that that bump is considerably closer to the spike of the blue light on the Gen 1, but on the Gen 2, that distance has increased, and that makes sense, and it's consistent with the other data that has been measured. Now that we've explored the actual analytical results and the findings between these two, I think that it's interesting to also observe whether or not these differences can be perceived and what can be perceived. So I'm going to show just a pure book, textbook, exactly the same book, and of course neither is using a front light. When I put them back to back, subjective impression is that when I'm looking at Gen 1, because it has a black frame or a darker frame than the whiteness of the image of the screen appears brighter, appears clearer, and I'm less distracted by the stuff that's happening around the device itself. Gen 2 is more beautiful. I am more in love with the design, I'm more in love with the frame and all of that kind of stuff. However, I'm also far more distracted from the content of the screen. And especially this area here is really detracting a lot from the attention. Maybe if it was black, maybe it would be less. But as it is in this version, that's what I'm observing. And the final observation that I can definitely notice, and I don't know if you can see it in the camera as well, or if this is simply an optical illusion live when you're looking at it, if I spend some more time looking between one and the other, my personal observation is that, or impression, is that the screen of the Kindle Gen 2 appears a little bit darker and a little bit grayer. This one is a little bit more amber. So those are the personal observations, and you also know the data observations that we've just covered. But I thought that it was meaningful to compare and contrast those back to back so that we can actually just see what it means to have the ability to quantify the data and have objective observation versus a subjective observation of the same thing. And finally, I just want to open and do the same exact thing, but with a comic book. This is the only comic book that I currently have on Kindle that I can actually easily find. The rest is somewhere buried deep in the, I don't know where, in the menus of it. But I think that this is kind of a good way of checking things out as well. So you have this really strong contrast with Frank Miller. I mean, the Sin City book is all about silhouettes and contrast, and it's an absolute masterpiece as far as that goes. However, it's also an interesting thing for me to see what the subjective impression is here. And here I have the same impression of the screen on the Gen 2 appearing subjectively darker than the Gen 1, but because of the framed nature of the drawings and the blocks basically here, and the frame that I have around it, it is a more interesting and engaging experience to read a comic with comic blocks than it is on the Gen 1. On the Gen 1, I find it less exciting and less engaging. On the Gen 2, because of these differences, because of these distractions, it appears more engaging. This is what it looks like when we switch it over to just zoomed in blocks. Otherwise, speed-wise and everything-wise, yeah, they're, to the best of my knowledge, I think that they're using the exact same SoC. I tried to verify that and find independent verification data for that, but that seems to be completely impossible to find without physically disassembling these, because no FCC filing detailing SoC has been issued, and Amazon is obviously not clarifying that kind of stuff. But it seems that they are using the same exact MediaTek SoC in both of the devices. Surface to screen distance on Kindle Scribe Gen 2 measures at 1.55 millimeters. And you can see that even though the point of the needle here was not exactly on the grid, I have adjusted that for the measurement here so that it matches exactly. And there where we measure out the point of the shadow, it's just over 1.5. So let's say something between 1.5 and 1.55 millimeters of screen of surface to screen distance on this device. Now, I think that this is a little bit higher than what we had on the Kindle Scribe Gen 1. However, I would need to repeat the same measurement using this same revised test with increased precision so that I can give you that with the 100% certainty. I can't attest yet if that's higher or lower than it was on the Kindle Scribe 1, but that is the measurement of the Kindle Scribe Gen 2. Writing latency on the Kindle Scribe Gen 2 is a very, very meaningful difference between Kindle Scribe 1 and Kindle Scribe Gen 2, because Kindle Scribe Gen 2 now measures out at 14.56 milliseconds, putting it right smack there with the Supernote Manta and the Books Note Max, and actually Remarkable Paper Pro. While the original Kindle Scribe was definitely not a slouch at 18.36 milliseconds, it was super fast. It's really interesting to see that seemingly the same type of a device is considerably faster as far as writing latency goes in the Gen 2 that's here. And possibly a further indication that maybe the Kindle Scribe Gen 1 and Kindle Scribe Gen 2 are not actually using the same exact display panels, because every measurable kind of test that has to do with the performance of the display is actually different between these two devices. Well, alrighty then. I don't know about you, but the nerd in me and the geek in me was really having a blast with this one, because it's so exciting to see that something that I work hard on basically starts to yield results, especially when it confirms that thing that I wanted and wished and hoped that it would be, to go beyond the subjective impressions and offer objective measurable data that is also meaningful and insightful. And in this case, that was definitely insightful, because the subjective impression at first was that while the Gen 1 and Gen 2 scribes are really similar, the opaqueness of Amazon and their complete unwillingness to just disclose what are the specifications of the device, because they're not even saying like what type of panel is being used, but the data indicates that something is meaningfully different as far as the display specifically goes between Scribe Gen 2 and Scribe Gen 1. It's not an easy thing to just say like, oh, this one's better, this one's worse. There are areas, for example, the rendering of blackness and contrast of Gen 2 Scribe is measurably better than the Scribe Gen 1, but then the uniformity and the perceived quality of the display is considerably better on the Scribe Gen 1 than it is on the Scribe Gen 2. And also we have the aspect of the front light, that while it is similar, the front light is a little bit colder on the Scribe Gen 2 than it is on the Scribe Gen 1. So those are the observations and the measurements and basically the conclusions that I can offer to you guys using the still in development, but something that I'm really excited about, the mydeepguide display analysis framework. It's starting to shape up slowly, but it is getting there. And yeah, again, I'm really excited by the results and the potential and the opening up the door of the new insights and new levels of understanding when dealing with these devices. I hope that you found the video enjoyable and or interesting, as I did. If you did, please like and subscribe and ding the notification bell in the description below to get notified when new videos come out on mydeepguide. This type of independence and the investment of developing these types of testing methodologies and results, that requires a lot of hours and expensive equipment, and that is only made possible by your support. So I thank you so much. And if you do want to support these efforts even further, then you can do that very easily in two ways. You can either make a direct donation as a super thanks comment in the comment section, or you can head on over to mydeepguide.com/shop, where you can find mydeepguide and MMP, which are both hyperlinked PDF organizer files that help you organize all of your personal or professional needs. More information on those you can find in the description below, but those are like really powerful workbook tools that are still just hyperlinked PDF files, but really well organized to help you get the maximum out of your e-paper devices, such as the Kindle Scribe, for example. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you in the next video. Bye!